Mike Perry is an intentional investor, out now, Epsilon Theory YouTube. We talked about charity and humility and his parents and their crazy little obscure religious sect. And you're not going to meet people or hear someone talk about charity and humility on the level. Pay attention to the cracks and the details of those stories. We talk about his nearly accidental nursing degree along the road to becoming a best-selling author. And most of all, we talk about the people, the improbable mentors along the way in his journey. It's really remarkable. Not every business that's built needs to scale to the moon. He's built an army of these businesses. I love this story. I love getting the background detail. Jack Forehand, let's roll some clips.
And I said, well, I'm going to quit my nursing job and take the physical therapy aid because he works straight days. And they just said, you can't do that. It's over, like it was something like a 60% pay cut.
Yeah.
And I said, well, is there a rule somewhere? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, I just want to work days. And I got money saved. I just learned that sometimes there's a ceiling and that's okay. And so whenever I would see those posters or hear people go, you just have to believe, I was like, no, I'm pretty sure they're just faster than me. I was raised in this obscure fundamentalist Christian sect. And these days I say I'm a bumbling agnostic with traces of amateur existentialism. But my parents personified charity and humility. My mom to her last breath, hundreds of children she took care of. The people who got turned away were always welcome at our farm. I had not met anyone who wrote. And then one day I ran into the woman who used to be a librarian at our little high school. And I said, oh, what are you doing these days? She goes, well, I've been doing some freelance writing. I don't know what that is. I said, what is that? She goes, well, I wrote an article about the Red Cedar River and I sold it to Wisconsin Trails magazine for $75. And I remember going, wait a minute, what? You can get paid for writing? I joke about it too. Sometimes I just say my secret to success, I'm too dumb to know when to quit. I was talking to my daughter about this. She said, do you ever wish you'd been more famous or more successful? And I said, well, sure, financially things could have been easier. But I said, at the age I'm at now, I said, I get to do all these different things, and yet they all come back to writing. Life has been rich and full. It continues to be full. And when I get up in the morning, and it happened this morning, the first thing I want to do is get to the keyboard. I want to write. And so that's kind of the bottom line, and being excited about the next thing and just being able to slog. Man, I'm built like a mule.
Welcome to The Intentional Investor with Matt Zeigler, where he and his guests explore the intersection of investing and life, portfolio and purpose. Nothing in this podcast is investment advice. Nothing in this podcast is advising you to buy or sell any security or to do anything with your money. Seriously, you should only act on investment advice from someone you know and who knows your unique situation. We are not that person. Matt Zeigler is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments, and the opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments or of Second Foundation Partners. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of Sunpoint Investments.
You're watching The Intentional Investor right here on Epsilon Theory YouTube. Check us out on epsilontheory.com. Check us out on panoptica.ai. I have a special guest here with me today. And really, I mean, what can I say? He's the sneezing cow of literary BSing. He's probably not your mentor because, I mean, all mentors are improbable if you really start to dig into it. And, of course, he's probably up there in my top 5 Perrys, maybe even at number 1. I'm going to put him definitely above Joe Perry. Katy Perry's probably below Joe Perry, big Joe Perry fan, maybe even over Perry Como. What can I say? My favorite Perry today, at least. Michael Perry, the author, the sneezing cow, all sorts of great stuff. Humorist, essayist, Township Fire participant, and contributor and volunteer. Welcome to The Intentional Investor.
Hey, man, this is great. I'm looking forward to this. I have no idea what's going to happen.
That is
sort of the story of my life.
Welcome to both of our lives, my friend. All right, you have to tell this story first because I just think this is wildly amusing to me. You were running track growing up, and you were perennially in third place. And there's so many life lessons inside of this. Tell me that story.
Yeah. So I went to a very, very small school. I grew up on a dairy farm in northern Wisconsin, grew up milking cows and baling hay, working in the fields. In the winter, we logged. So I grew up skidding logs and slinging slabs on the sawmill. But I was allowed to choose two sports, and I played football because I loved football. I was a good kid. I was well behaved, but there's just no getting around it. I loved the violence of football because it was the one place where I could get that all out and inside the context of the rules. And then I played basketball because that was the second most popular sport. I was terrible at basketball. I was the worst basketball player ever, a vertical leap of about 2 inches, and couldn't dribble or shoot. Other than that, I was pretty good. And I got in trouble at school for something quite mild, but my parents were very strict. They were loving, kind people, but they had a code, and if you violated it, they made you pay. So my dad said, you're off the basketball team. If you can keep it together till the spring, you can go ahead and go out for track, which I thought I didn't want to go out for because it wasn't very glamorous. But I ended up going out for track. Again, I'm not very fast, but I'm stubborn. And so I wound up running the 1 mile and 2 mile, and I turned out to be okay. I could run a 4:48 mile when I was in high school.
Very
and
impressive.
so where we get to your story is that I was the only guy on the track team my senior year. We were that small of a school. And so I would train with these two guys from the school up the road. They were a small school too, but bigger than us. And they were both really good. They were terrific distance runners at the 1 mile and the 2 mile. And so I knew pretty much where I stood. And then every year it would get proven to me because I would win our conference in the 1 mile and 2 mile. And then we would have what we called regionals, and I would place, I usually win the regional or place second. And what happened is the top 2 people from the regionals would then go on to sectionals. And so at that point, I would be thrown in to the race with my 2 buddies up the road because we had the same sectional.
So you'd like branch off.
Right. So we'd start out in separate regionals so we could each make it to sectionals.
Yeah.
But then the 3 of us would consistently finish 1, 2, 3 in sectionals. And they only take the top 2 out of sectionals to go to the state competition. And I was always third. And I had trained with these guys year round, and we're good friends. We got along fine, but we competed very hard against each other. But what we're getting to in the life lesson category that I valued so much way back then, even as a teenager, was I just learned that sometimes there's a ceiling, and that's okay. And so whenever I would see those posters or hear people go, "You just have to believe," I was like, "No, I'm pretty sure they're just faster than me." And that's not the worst. You know, we live in this age or this world or this culture where it's like, just believe, just try harder. If you dream it, you can. It's like, I could dream winning the 2 mile at sectionals as much as I wanted. It wasn't going to happen. So that's my valuable life lesson. I think the other life lesson related to sports that I had, you didn't ask to hear this one, but as long as we're here. So keep in mind, again, very rural Wisconsin school, small. At that time, almost all of my classmates were, at least over half of them were growing up on small dairy farms. So we were getting up and doing chores, milking cows, shoveling manure, stacking hay bales. And also we lived in Wisconsin, so sub-zero temperatures in the winter. And I mentioned the logging. So we get this new high school football coach comes in, and he decides to have, for parents' night, he decides to have meet the team night or meet the coach, whatever. Well, the first misstep is he schedules it for 7 p.m. on a weeknight. Well, all the farmers are milking cows at 7 p.m., so you just don't do that. So that's his first misstep. Then he stands up in front of this whole group of crusty, hardcore farmers, and he's very fresh out of college. He's got the Sansa belt sports, the coach shorts on, and probably even the whistle. And he's deep into this speech, and he so earnestly says, sports teach you about life. And even again at 17, I'm looking at the assembled crew, and most of them have been up since 5 a.m. milking cows and fixing manure spreaders at 20 below. And I just thought, no, I think chipping out a frozen manure spreader when it's 20 below teaches you about life. And so the other thing that I remember thinking too, after having played sports for a while, was no. On the other hand, sports do teach you about life, and they teach you that if you're really, really good at something, the rules don't apply to you. So
You're in a
So
different
that's-
classification. It's a
yes,
different category.
I
of
loved sports, but I took some the rules or the lessons that I took from sports weren't always the ones that they put on the poster.
All right. I'm taking you all the way back. Now, Wisconsin, born and raised, right?
Yep, Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. They still haven't put up the statue. I check every time I go through there, but
It's coming. Statues in the mail. Statues in the mail.
nice.
How did mom and dad end up there?
So mom and dad were both city kids from a town called, I was going to say a little town. It's like about 60,000 called Eau Claire, Wisconsin, about an hour and a half east of Minneapolis. They were both city kids. My mom, from the time she was little all the way through college, said she didn't care who she married as long as she didn't marry a farmer. My dad was a city kid with a chemistry degree. He was working at Archer Daniels Midland in the cities for a little while. And then they got married, and he was working in the paper mills over on the east side of Wisconsin. And so he's working in the paper mills, and he decides he wants to be a farmer. And so in 1966, they bought a farm in northern Wisconsin. And my mom just died at the age of 84. And she died in that farmhouse, and she was never happier. For all she said that she didn't want to be a farm wife, it wound up to be the perfect life. And so, yeah, my parents met because of the alphabet. They had the same homeroom. And my dad was he was a good kid. He was very smart. He was a talented athlete, but he was also a bit of a knucklehead, kind of a tearaway, as they would say back in the day. And he, at one point, just realized he was going off the rails, and he said, I need to find myself a steady woman of faith. And so he said, I got out my Rolodex. I'm like, Dad, what? And he's telling me this.
You didn't keep a Rolodex of your steady women of faith?
Well, and he's the most ethical, humble, wonderful man I've ever known. But he's telling me this story at the age of 83, and he's not being lecherous about it. He just said, yes, I got out the Rolodex. I go, Dad, really? A Rolodex? And he said, and your mom's name came up, and I was like, oh no, she's such a stick in the mud, the phrase he uses. So he said, so I went through again, but she just kept coming up. And when she died, they'd been married over 60 years, and they had one of those, gosh, I get choked up thinking about it, because they had one of those marriages that respect, love, affection, conversation. So for all the humorous elements to how they met, and mom not wanting to marry a farmer, they had a wonderful, wonderful life together. So yeah, I could have been a lot of different things. I am told I was conceived in Illinois, but thankfully mom got over the border in time for me to be a Packers fan.
Oh,
so here we are.
Sneaking you over. Okay. The dad, this whole like transition to farmer thing kind of boggles my mind, and only to the degree you know the story about him. Like, where's the experience come from? Because would you say chemical engineering was like Archdan?
Yeah, I think he worked at Archer Daniels Midland in the cities at one
sure.
point, and then like I said, he was working. But I skipped part of the story because I wasn't gonna bury you in it, but I'll hit it now.
Bury
because
me in this because I'm really curious.
So my mom and dad meet in high school. I said the bit about the Rolodex. Well, what I didn't say also is that my mom was part of a very obscure fundamentalist religious sect. And I love to say that because it makes people nervous.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
And what
fun.
happened is that she told my dad that they fell in love, but she had decided she was going to Mexico. She was in nursing school by now because she was a nurse. And she did, I guess you'd call it kind of an internship, where she went to Mexico and worked with impoverished folks in Mexico as a nurse. While she was down there, because this is her belief, she had prayed about it, and she had decided, I love this man, but I can't marry him because he doesn't share my faith. Unbeknownst to her, and without him saying anything to her, when she came back, he on his own had gone to the elders of that church and converted. And he remains a part of that. Well, that sect, there's another whole story about that. But I was raised in this obscure fundamentalist Christian sect. And these days, I say I'm a bumbling agnostic with traces of amateur existentialism. But my parents personified charity and humility. My mom to her last breath, hundreds of children she took care of. The people who got turned away were always welcome at our farm. She gave her life to taking care of kids with illnesses and disabilities and unfortunate circumstances. So again, whenever I say this fundamentalist Christian sect, it sounds so scary, but it was loving and gentle. But what happened is, so she comes back from Mexico, lo and behold, he is converted. And so they get married and they joined the Peace Corps. And she always said, man, you're going to have to edit this down so much. I'm getting into minutia here. But
this is great.
I was raised in a time, because of the church, we didn't have television. We didn't go to movies. We didn't listen to the radio. But Mom filled the house with books. And I became an avid reader from the age of 4, thanks to my mom. But the other thing we did is, because we didn't have TV, about once or twice a month, Dad would finish the chores, the milking. Mom would make some popcorn and cheese and slice up apples, and we would get to sit in the living room. We had a big fluctuating family because of all my adoptive and foster siblings. We would sit in the living room of the farmhouse and watch slides, because my parents had a slide camera and a slide projector. And so I knew my parents had been in the Peace Corps. And they had slides of that time, and us kids loved to watch it because their Peace Corps training took place in 2 stages. The first stage was in Illinois, and maybe at Southern Illinois University, I'd have to double check, but one of those universities in Illinois. And the only photos, that was mostly classroom stuff, and so the only photos that existed from their time in Illinois were they had this 3-day ice storm. And so they had these slides of broken tree branches and power lines that were down on the sidewalk and ice covering everything. And then the second part of their training took place in Hawaii. So then
That's a little different.
Absolutely. And they had a ton of photos of lava flows and sugarcane fields and all these amazing exotic flowers. And so as kids, we were just fascinated by all the Hawaii photos. Well, they finished their training in Hawaii. They were about to ship out somewhere in Asia, and Mom came up pregnant. Now, she always wants you to understand that she was well within the legal bounds of the marriage, like the math works, all that stuff. My mother was a very devout woman, very matter of fact, but I never in my life heard her make an off-color joke or a double entendre. She was very frank with us as children about the facts of life. It wasn't one of those cases where, because of her faith, she treated it like something evil or that you didn't talk about. But she was just very pragmatic about it. But she would never make light of anything that had to do with sexuality or the birds and the bees. So for years, they're pregnant. They come back to Wisconsin. They're working at the paper mills. I'm born while Dad is working at the paper mills. And so for years, people would say, have you ever been to Hawaii? And I would always say, well, no, but I got my start there. So I'd make this little joke for years. And one day I'm well into my 30s. We're at a family get together. My mom is there, my dad, some aunts and uncles, cousins. And the topic of Hawaii comes up, and someone says, have you ever been there? And I said, no, but I got my start there. Well, I go to the kitchen to get something, and there's a little hallway connecting the dining room to the kitchen, and my mother is waiting for me. And my mom had a habit, when she was discomfited by something, she would pat her thighs. And she's standing in the hallway waiting for me, patting her thighs. And I thought, oh, what have I done? And she said, I know you love to tell that story about being conceived in Hawaii, but it's not true. I said, what do you mean it's not true? She said, I'm pretty sure it was during a 3-day ice storm in Illinois. Mom?
I'm pretty sure. Not positive. There's a margin of error here, Mike. I need to just express to you. But I think I've narrowed this down.
So there we are now. We're living in a little log cabin tar paper shack in Nakusa, Wisconsin. And my dad, I think he kind of was I hate these terms, but probably kind of a conservative hippie. I think he really kind of wanted to get back to the land. I think and they wanted a lot of children. And so I think he just kind of wanted to he wasn't happy working in the corporate world. He was kind of caught in between. As an engineer, he spent half his time in the office and half his time on the floor, and he related to the folks on the floor a lot more than he related to the folks in the office. And then he also had an uncle who was a farmer in northern Wisconsin, and he had wonderful memories of going to that farm when he was a kid. So I think all of these things played into that. So they bought this farm in 1966. He didn't know what he was doing. He got some sheep. But thankfully, it was an era when farms were still small and everybody shared machinery. And there were two neighbors in particular that, rather than making fun of the idiot from the city, they took him under their wing. And one farmer in particular, they started trading labor. And all my life, my father farmed with this man named Jerry. And they traded labor back and forth for 25 years and never once kept a ledger.
That's amazing.
They'd say, we're going to hay at your place today. We're going to pick corn here. And so that's, so we wound up on the farm. So I'm a farm kid, but I could have been a Hawaii kid. I could have been a city kid, or heaven forbid, I could have been an Illinois kid. We have a term for people from Illinois, but.
How big's the family? How many brothers and sisters?
So that's a question that's impossible to answer. So I have, just simply for the sake of description, I have two quote unquote blood brothers. And then I have 3 adopted sisters, but I have just a plethora of mom took care of foster children, respite care children. I say mom, it was mom and dad. They made this life together intentionally. And I had foster siblings that spent their entire life with us. I had a sister who came to us when she was just months old and died when she was 6 because of a long-term illness, and she spent her entire life with us. I had another brother who lived from the age of infancy to 11 and died in our home. Same deal, long-term disability that we knew was terminal. So when people say how many, like when I still lived at home and even in college times, they say, well, how many people are in your family? And I would always say, well, let me just check. And it was very common to sit down at our supper table, which was this big table with all the leaves in it, chairs around 3 sides, and just one big long wooden bench along the backside. And it was very common to sit down in those places, or sit down for supper and not necessarily recognize everybody. And my dad, who was this very quiet, soft-spoken man, but very funny, very dry humor. He's the kind of guy who would say something and 10 minutes later, you go, that was funny.
There it is.
But one of his line was when we'd have guests and for supper or dinner or lunch or whatever, the food would start going around and they would, politely take a little bit. And my dad would just say, take what you want the first time because it ain't coming around again.
Perfect. Poetic and true in all the ways. All
and
right.
I don't know if you heard that ding, but I have all of my notifications silenced except for my children and the fire department. So.
This is a good rule. This is a good rule.
And that was the fire department, but it's something that is not in my area, so I don't have to respond. Yeah.
Nothing's on fire under your immediate.
No, I'm on the fire department, but I'm actually most active as a first responder, an EMR, emergency medical responder, and so our job is to just try to get to these remote areas or to the calls ahead of time, do our best to stabilize things till paramedics get there. On fires, I used to do all of it. I have firefighter 1, firefighter 2 training. I loved firefighting and, crawled into the burning buildings. And but when I moved to this, I live in a little more populous area and they have a whole bunch more equipment. And I'm on the road so much that I don't feel comfortable. I would not be trained well enough to run all the equipment, but I do know how to use everything in that little orange bag I carry. So.
Fantastic.
But I still go to fires just to do firefighter rehab, which is we have a special trailer, and while they're in fighting the fire, when they come out, we track their vital signs and make it where there's certain standards you have to hit before you can go back in.
Got it. Well, it's another ceiling and limitation to be aware of in that sense then, right?
Yeah. It's all right. I had 12 really great years of active firefighting and managed to get out alive, so maybe it's okay to
We'll take this.
Dial it back.
Aside from the slideshows,
Yeah.
and maybe let's take me there first. Like the books that are in the house, are they religious books? Is it fiction? Is it
No,
leftovers?
So the memory I have of the evolution of my reading was, it starts with my mom reading to me, as with many children. And she just said, I just loved books. And I loved them so much that I was bugging her constantly. And she was a reader as well. And so one of the things she did, and I wrote about this, I wrote a book called Coop. And I wrote about this in that book, that she would sit with me. She would read a chapter of Winnie the Pooh to me. And I'm talking about the thick, heavy text version, not the Disneyfied. That's the old classic. She'd read a chapter of Winnie the Pooh to me. She would then hand me that hardcover book, and she would read a chapter of her book to herself before reading me another chapter aloud. And it took me years to realize what a wonderful thing she'd done, which is she had taught me to love the idea of sitting quietly with a book even before I could read it. And then at the age of 4, she said I started, pointing out letters and sounds. And so she sent away, it was an age when you used to send away for things. She sent away to a Chicago newspaper for a phonics comic book. And she used this phonics comic book to teach me how to read. And so I could read from the age of 4, and I just started reading everything at hand. And again, I wrote about this in Coop, about I'm one of those people, and I know your audience is full of them. If I stop moving, I got to read. And so, yes, books, but also the back of the Crest toothpaste. I used to be able to quote that whole thing. Crest have been shown to be an effective decay preventive dentifrice when applied in a conscientiously applied program of oral hygiene. And so read anything. But then I remember when I skipped over. I remember reading the Bobbsey Twins, which was a really old series of books. Yeah, when I
Bobbsey
was
Twins
really
and Hardy
young.
Boys. These are all staples of leftover in the house things.
And then I know that in 3rd grade, I read All Quiet on the Western Front. And
3rd grade.
Yeah, 3rd grade.
Yes.
And the reason I bring that up isn't to I pretty much peaked by 5th grade, by the way. But in 3rd grade, I read All Quiet on the Western Front. And the reason I remember that so distinctly is it affected a profound shift in my worldview, even at the age of 3rd grade, which was, I had been reading lots of cowboy books. I love Louis L'Amour cowboy books and Zane Grey. And Zane Grey, I ride for Louis, man. We can get into a whole discussion about that. But his influence on me had as much to do with his bio as his books. But I'd been reading a lot of just cowboy books, Westerns. And I remember I started reading All Quiet on the Western Front. I have no idea how I got it. I still have the original copy. It's an old tattered hardcover. I have no idea how I wound up with it, but I started reading it. And I was, of course, into it for all the wrong reasons, because I was in 3rd grade. I was drawing war pictures. I think a lot of kids go through that stage. Me and my buddy Eric, we drew all these World War II airplanes dropping bombs and guys shooting rifles, because you think of war as glamorous. And I'm reading this book, All Quiet on the Western Front, and really enjoying the story and this soldier, and he's such a good guy and everything. And then all of a sudden, and rereading it as an adult, you realize the clues are there immediately. But as a 3rd grader, I'm way into the book when all of a sudden he mentions killing a Frenchman. And I knew just enough 3rd grade history to go, wait a minute, the French, they were on our side. Wait a minute, this guy's the bad guy. And that, again, just what a huge, profound insight to get as a 3rd grader to go, wait a minute, I liked this guy when I knew him as a human. He has all the same worries and sadnesses and hopes and happinesses. He just got thrown into this situation where he's in a trench in Germany, or in a trench somewhere else as a German. And so that book just, it began as a dumb kid reading a war story. And I came out of that book still, a knucklehead from rural Wisconsin, but things all of a sudden were a little more complicated. And then I remember in 4th grade reading all Gone with the Wind. And then in 5th grade, I remember getting busted by my teacher for sneak reading. We had those desks where the top would pop, you could raise the top, and if you just raised it a little, you could sneak peeks at what you had in there. And I was sneak reading Serpico, I don't know. Yeah.
Why'd you, what, another
Again,
one? No clue where it came from?
I don't know, man. Yeah. I mean, I think I would just grab books and read them. And then, of course, and we had my mom every couple of weeks took us to the little local library too. So there was a tiny little library, and I checked out every Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour book. I also you could check out records, and Mom would let us listen to we couldn't listen to the radio, but we could listen to specific records. But because of the church, she had to proof them. There was one, we had a collection of railroad songs, old railroad songs. It was probably one of those Time Life type albums. Yeah. And there was one on there, Bill Grogan's Goat, I remember was the title of it. And there was one word in there that was mildly objectionable. I mean, compared to what we're pelted with today, It wouldn't even register. But I remember my mom just saying, no, we can't listen to that. So this was on an old LP. So she took a needle and she made a scratch so that it would get to that track, and then it would just go and skip right across that track. And I remember in one of the books I wrote, and if you think that's censorship, you're exactly right. That's exactly what she intended. But anyway, it was those books. And then, as I said, definitely the Bible, just because it was consistently present. And every Sunday I heard it. Part of this little church that I was raised in is we didn't believe in churches. That was a form of, the building itself is a form of idolatry as far as we were concerned. And so we just met in a farmhouse, and you sat in chairs and you sang hymns a cappella, and you offered up simple prayers, and if you had taken a certain step, you offered up your own homily. You were supposed to have been reading the Bible all week and studying some verses, and then you would offer your thoughts on that verse. And that turned out to really help me as a writer, because you can pretty much hand me whatever you want, and I will offer you up a sermon in the next 5 minutes on the metaphorical and spiritual implications of whatever you just handed me. Because sometimes it's possible that a guy showed up for church and maybe hadn't been reading all week, and you had to come up with something real quick.
Did you find yourself in that seat as a kid, a teenager, like where you were doing the homilies?
Oh, yeah. So the way ours worked was there were 2 steps in our faith, which was professing, which is the way that you did it is they would have what we called gospel meetings. We didn't have preachers as such. We had what we called workers. They would go out in pairs, 2 by 2. That was based on an interpretation of the New Testament. They didn't get paid. They gave up all their worldly possessions except for a suitcase with some clothes, and they stayed with members of the church. And then, of course, behind the scenes, people paid for gas, and someone supplied them with a car and things like that. It truly was quite stripped down. They're very recently, sadly, and I say sadly because there were so many of those folks were good people. But like so many churches, they recently had a sex scandal, and it's, in the old days, nobody knew. Now it's been a Netflix special, and I have people tell me, including experts, that I was in a cult, and I go, well, maybe, possibly, but everybody, and their downfall came. It's the same old story. Someone did something, and rather than deal with it, they just didn't talk about it. They just moved that person to another place. And so, where was I? And it was heartbreaking for me just because my parents, my mother at the very end of her faithful life withdrew from that church on principle. She just said, no, I can't be part of this. And we didn't know about this, and I can't do it. And she did not lose her faith, but I'm sure she left this earth worried about her bumbling agnostic son. But anyway, I forget, where was I?
The bumbling agnostic son was going to tell me about these homilies.
The steps, yeah. So these ministers that we had, their main job wasn't to preach to us. Their job was to go out and spread the gospel, to use the term of art. Anyway, but they would have these gospel meetings, and at the end of some gospel meetings, they would do what they called test the meeting. So you would have a hymn you would sing in closing, and they would say, and if you want tonight to profess your faith and join this church, during the last verse, rise to your feet. And once you had professed, then you were allowed to take part in meeting, as in you were allowed to pray out loud with the rest, and you were allowed to offer up your homily. You were not, however, allowed to partake in what we called the emblems, which would be the wine and the bread. We had the bread. The wine was grape juice because we thought alcohol was evil. So I made it through professing. And part of the reason I really value that too is I wrote about this, I think in the book Coop in depth, but I professed in the basement of, I think it was the Moose Hall in Barron, Wisconsin. And part of the reason that I treasure that is that I remember having it's that born again experience. I rose to my feet and I remember being stricken with some powerful feeling and a sense of relief. And I also remember what it was like to be part of that group and to love to gather with them away from what we called the capital T, capital W, the world. So I can still remember all those things with affection, even as I've drawn away for various reasons. But once I professed, then I could, when I would go to Sunday morning meeting, and I think I was 12 or 14, somewhere in there, I would go to, and I would say, well, I've been reading in James, this verse and this verse, based on this verse, I want to try harder this week to do X, Y, and Z. And then we did not have baptism at birth. The final step was you would choose to be baptized in the church. And once you were baptized and we did full immersion baptism, then you would partake of the emblems. You would have the wine and the bread. And I became disillusioned before taking that step. But again, I can't stress it's an odd place to be in. Disillusioned, disappointed in some humans, but who isn't, but never bitter. I think it's an odd place to be in, to have rejected something, walked away from it, and yet be daily grateful that I was raised in it. And I think it just helps. Again, my folks, they, unbeknownst to us, were challenging the workers and the elders constantly. And I think probably quietly they were imparting that to us, that, be careful when the organization becomes more than the spirit. And then again, just their example of humility and charity. I'll never in a million years live up to the quality of character that my parents lived. Yeah.
Where do you start learning? And my hunch is that it's because of the farm work. It's because of whatever else. And it's this balance between like the stuff we have to do for us all to survive. And I imagine the wheels start to turn of like you wanting to have some control over your own direction with it, not just as part of the family. Where's that like independence come from? How do you learn those lessons or start to?
Man, it started really early in that we were raised. I remember my brothers and I just going off to the woods for the whole day with axes and cutting down trees and doing dangerous things, not crazy things, but just things that young kids do in the country, unsupervised. And there was freedom in that. And I had loving, caring parents. So it wasn't like they just dropped us off somewhere to get in trouble. It was like, go, learn, explore, be curious, be careful. But, if you do chop a finger off, we'll figure it out. And so there was that independence. The big marker for me was at the age of 16. I mentioned earlier that I had a sister who died young. She died at the age of 6, and she died in our home after an extended illness. And in order to take care of her for the last year of her life, my father sold the milk cows, which was just a dramatic gamble because that was our main source of income. But in order to split the 24-hour care required for this child with my mother, he couldn't keep milking cows. So he sold the milk cows, and then they had to live off the income from that sale. And two things happened. One was because he all of a sudden had it couldn't have been that much money, but it was just enough that happened to be the year that our school guidance counselor told me to apply for financial aid for college. And all of a sudden, after being raised well below the poverty line, I didn't qualify for any loans or assistance because of this money my dad had for 1 year, which we had to live off for 3 years. And I remember getting angry about that and going, they don't understand. The system doesn't understand. So I'm not going to take a penny. Well, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I just said, I'm not taking any loans. I'm not taking your money. I'm going to go pay for college myself. Now, quick, before I turn into the old guy going, by God, in my day, I did put myself through college, working 3 jobs. But as we know, the economic dynamics were completely different. So when I tell this story, understand it's for a reason other than me saying, why don't you kids do X these days? But in my case, I didn't realize it at the time. I was going to take all the loans I could get because that's what the guidance counselor said you should do.
This is how you go to college.
This is how you go to college.
And you figure it out later.
But I didn't qualify, and then I got pissed about it, and I got stubborn about it. And so I've said, even later when I did qualify, I wouldn't take it. Well, that turned out to be a huge advantage because I graduated from, I'll get to that later, remind me, about when I graduated from college, my financial situation. So that was a big part, them rejecting me and me realizing the system isn't always going to be there for you. And again, it's not like I sat down and wrote this in my journal. It was kind of like with the All Quiet on the Western Front experience. It's just these little things subconsciously register. Even bigger than this. So my sister then dies. I'm 16. My sister dies. My dad is going to get cows and start milking again, but you don't just go buy a bunch of milk cows. You buy a bunch of what we call spring heifers, and you take care of them and until they calve and start milking. And so for the first time in his life, he didn't have a child that required 24/7 care, and he didn't have to milk cows twice a day, 7 days a week. And he had worked for 2 years on 2 different ranches out in Wyoming. And when we grew up, some of the slides we watched were of Wyoming. And I was always fascinated by Wyoming and the cowboy culture because of my Louisville Moore books. And my dad had all these he was a wonderful storyteller, and he would tell stories about Wyoming. And so he says, and in the meantime, I'm also a 16-year-old who started to grow his hair a little bit, and that was frowned upon very much in our church. A man must have short hair. It's an abomination if you have long hair. And I'd become very stubborn 16-year-old. My father and I always got along. We butted heads pretty much from the time I was 14 until I was 39. But it was a very Midwestern Scandinavian type of, it was... Anyone looking from the outside would never have known. It was just just a certain set to the jaw. Yeah. And the other thing I'll say in all seriousness and with all my heart is I never once in my life lost my respect or love for him, because he just was his life commanded that sort of quiet respect. But things weren't real easy. And so my sister dies, and my father, I think in part just because of his grieving, said, how about you and I take a trip out to Wyoming, to that ranch I used to work on? I've always wanted to show it to you. And like I said, I now realize as an adult and a parent, he also just needed to go. He needed to grieve.
Yeah.
And the people who ran that ranch were also in the same church as we were. So we drive out to Wyoming in our old van, just me and him. It's in that time when things are tough, but we still like each other. We spend a few days at the ranch. It's wonderful. I see the cabin he used to live in. I see the fields he used to make hay in. And on the last day, the boss, we're sitting in the living room of the ranch house, and the boss says to me, he goes, hey, we're short on some hands for the hay crew this summer. We need someone to run a swather, which is a big hay cutting machine. He goes, you grew up running equipment. He said, do you think you could work for us out here this summer? And I immediately just looked at my dad, and my thought is, well, no, I can't, because I got to help Dad. I help Dad every summer on the farm, and all year round we have chores, so I can't do that. And I just kind of looked at him like, and Dad said, well, we'll talk about it tonight. So that night, we were supposed to leave the next day. That night, we went up to the guest bedroom where they had us, and Dad said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I'd like to, but I help you with chores at home, and I do all this, and he thought it over, and then finally he said, I think you should do this. I think this might be interesting for you. And so I wound up working out there for the next 5 summers. That's how I put myself through college. I worked as a cowboy and on the hay crew and did roundup and branding. And 2 decades pass. We're at some sort of family get-together. My dad, as he often is at the end of a long table filled with people, sitting quietly, holding one of the children that he and my mom are taking care of. We get into stories, and the whole Wyoming story comes up, and about him taking me out to see the ranch in Wyoming. And lo and behold, they asked me if I wanted to work out there. And all of a sudden I stopped and I turned and I looked at my dad 20 years later. I said, "You knew you were going to leave me out there before we even left, didn't you?" And this quiet little smile just spread across his face.
Sometimes you get the joke in 5 minutes. Sometimes it's 2 decades.
It was so lovely. But so that was a big step, because I started living on a ranch in Wyoming at the age of 16 and working hard 6 days a week. And then at 18, I graduated and went away to college. Literally here's another part of the story. I had 40 minutes from home was the state college, University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And I went and got a nursing degree, and people say, well, how did you choose a nursing degree? Well, on the one hand, I knew what I was getting into because my mom was a nurse. A lot of my siblings were so ill that I would have to accompany my mom while they went to the hospital for surgeries and care, because Dad had to stay home and run the farm. So I was very familiar with that whole profession and that atmosphere and that environment. But I didn't have some burning desire to be a nurse. But what happened is I loved to read, and I loved to sneak off to the library. And if your grades were good at our little school, you were allowed to skip class when the university recruiters came and gave their pitch. And so I went to everyone I could, but I would not go to they would meet in the library, but they'd sit at the table. I'd go over to the magazine rack and read Sports Illustrated. And so I literally, with all clarity, remember sitting in the chair at the magazine rack with a copy of Sports Illustrated open on my lap, reading away. And the university recruiter is over at the table with the really good students saying, well, we have, you can get degrees in biology, accounting, business, nursing, art. And I remember going, nursing? Well, that sounds interesting. I'll do that. That was the
like
entire...
it floated in while you're reading Sports
I was like,
Illustrated.
okay,
like,
check. Yeah,
I'll do that one.
So I applied to nursing school. It was really hard to get in. There were 2 people going for every position. But then I got in, and then I wanted to do well. I took it seriously. And so and you had to maintain a pretty high GPA to stay in the School of Nursing. I got through that. Then I thought, well, I should pass my boards. So I studied for my boards, and I passed my boards. And then I started working as a nurse. And even in college, I mean, I working 2 or 3 jobs at a time. That was another step in the independence and in getting out on my own. So that was kind of, I mean, it was that progression. I think definitely started with being a kid free in the country. And then it started with my dad dropping me off in Wyoming at the age of 16. And then college, I just, I left home not realizing I was leaving home. I was just going to go to college. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, this is a very late realization, and I will never be able to, apparently, and I don't know if I can still look this up, but apparently I had really good ACT, SAT,
Sure. Whatever the version was at the time. Maybe both.
Apparently I had really high scores.
Okay.
And I remember standing in the porch of our old farmhouse, surrounded by clothes that smelled like the barn, looking at and discarding letters from Brown University, from Cornell, because I just remember thinking, well, there's a college in Eau Claire. It's only 40 minutes away. Like
every college is a college, so like
it was literally that naive. And so I say that with no sense of regret. And they could have been very general letters, but obviously there was a reason I was getting letters from the Ivy League, right? Right. And the idea that I just threw them away, not out of disdain, but just out of like, well, why would I do that? There's a college right down the road. So there's pros. I do sometimes wonder, what might have happened, but
who knows?
Here we are.
So how you come out of college and you're working as a nurse right away, and are you hospitals?
Well, not right away, because now we get back to my finances.
This is the finance story. Okay.
So because it was a different age and tuition cost less, and I lived with my grandparents, but I paid them rent. But because it was a different age, I worked 3 jobs, and I got some scholarships because of my grades, and so I was able to cash flow my tuition. And I was naive. I remember making it all, I told the story already about turning down financial aid, not even realizing that you could, what it was. And again, I just went to college. I'm cash flowing. I worked as a roller skating Snoopy at the roller rink. I mean, I worked as whatever it took. And all of a sudden we're at our senior year and all my classmates are like, and these were smart people and good people. But they were all going, yeah, I got to get a job because I have to start paying off my loans. And I was going, loan? What are these loans? And like,
do I have any of those?
Student loans? Yeah, they go, I don't have any of those. And so the upshot of it is that when I graduated from nursing school, I had $1,000 in the bank. So not only did I not have any debt, but I had $1,000. And so the joke that I often make is that, so I didn't need a job. Right? I was 21 years old with $1,000. So I went trucking with my uncle. I went trucking out to the East Coast and back. And I've written about that and about how he was one of my mentors, my Uncle Stan, the trucker. But then I came back and I did finally have to get a job. And so my first job was with a surgeon, oromaxillofacial surgeon in northern Wisconsin. I think I got that job because I went in to interview for it and we kind of hit it off. And then he said, oh, by the way, we won't be able to work the last week of November because I go deer hunting. And I said, well, that's excellent news because that's where I'll be too. Right. And so I worked for him.
Bonded.
Yeah. And then my last job, I worked in a hospital as on a neuro rehab unit, working with people who had traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, strokes, amputations, that sort of thing. And the point is, I liked being a nurse. I still identify largely as a nurse, and I take great pride in that profession on behalf of the nurses who continue to do that good work. So I didn't leave because I was unhappy. I left because in 7th grade, here I was, this kid that was extremely well-read, but I never wrote really and the idea that I might write books never occurred to me. And again, it's a little bit like the not understanding financial aid, not understanding why a guy might want to go to Cornell. I just simply didn't have the data. And so to me, writers, these books, I was reading piles and piles of books, but writers were these distant, mysterious people from other places.
This is a question I had specifically for you.
Yeah.
At this point in life, do you still not know a writer?
Oh, no, I know a few, although less than you'd think.
No, but back then.
Oh.
Like, had you met a writer, or were they just purely these books and magazines and newspapers sort of magically manifest in my life? Yeah. But whoever makes these is just a form.
No, I can tell you, I remember the very first writer I ever met, and I'll tell you about that.
Please, because as I was going through this, I'm like, I don't understand the leap of
no,
because you never mentioned a single practicing writer.
It starts in 7th grade. I mean, when I was a little kid, and I have, my mom kept it. I wrote a little book when I was in kindergarten with pictures of going to the zoo. But there's nothing in it to suggest that, this is what's going to happen. I did many other things too and abandoned them. But there are two very signal moments, and then they will then lead to the first writer.
Okay.
If you can help me remember. I've made a living off of going off on tangents. You can't tell.
It's the best living one can make.
So in 7th grade, I'm this very well-read knucklehead, but I read a lot of books. I've got quite a vocabulary, and I'm a decent kid. I'm a knucklehead, but I'm not evil or mean or anything like that. I'm just a doofus Midwestern boy. I think like the singer Greg Brown said, I'm a big, dumb Midwest boy. And in 7th grade, I have this English teacher who's pretty strict. A lot of people didn't like her. But one day in 7th grade, we show up for class, and instead of the usual assignments, circle the verb, underline the noun, whatever it was, she has taped a black and white photo of an old farmhouse to the blackboard. And she said, your assignment today is to write whatever you want about that image. And we all locked up because we're just, what's the assignment? What's the right answer we're supposed? And she said, no, just write about what you see. And I remember I started to write, and I found it recently. It was as bad as you'd expect, but I wrote something along the line, I'm an old man, returned to the farmhouse of my childhood, yonder the clover fields of my youth.
Oh, wow. Look at you.
But what I do remember...
A young Faulkner.
Right. What I do remember is getting an actual visceral thrill at the act of writing. And the reason that I noticed it, it was the same thrill I got when I was hammering down the road in a pickup truck. It was the same thrill I got when I was playing football. 7th grade, I had started playing football already, contact football. But then that class is over. We go right back to circle the noun, the verb. I don't really think about it anymore. Still keep reading books, but I'm not a writer. Then I go to nursing school. Well, the nursing school curriculum is very prescribed. You don't get a lot of options, but this was one of those, we've been warned, I was warned, one of these horrible liberal arts schools. And they required us to take some humanities credits. And I remember bristling against this. And I wrote an essay once called Scarlet Ribbons about how I resented having to skip, I should be learning how to do surgery, not film 101. But one of the things I did is I took a creative writing course, probably half a credit, just to fill that space on my transcript. And I got into that class and I lucked into this terrific professor who was challenging and difficult. But I remember writing our first assignment and going, whoa, wait a minute. That's that feeling I had in 7th grade. And the other thing that happened that was signal was he was tough. I don't think he could teach today. And he would take your stuff and mark it up, red pen it, and talk about it. I mean, part of your agreement was your stuff is going to get critiqued in front of the class. And I remember watching people wilt or he'd hurt their feelings. I mean, I remember him telling one poor woman, she had written a poem about her grandma. Oh, no. And he said, and that her grandma had died. And this professor said, it's okay to write about your grandma, but you have to make me care about your grandma. He said, I don't care that your grandma died. Everybody's grandma dies. And I was like, and you would just see people wilt. But I remember the day he took my piece up in front, and I had worked really hard on this poem. And I remember thinking, well, folks are in for a little bit of a treat today.
Yeah. They'll be talking about this.
Yeah, he's going to be hard pressed to come up with anything negative to say here. This is going to be encomiums all around. And so he immediately just starts ripping it apart. And what surprised me was every comment he made, I was that guy on the football team. I mentioned I loved football. I loved hitting and tackling. And I was that guy where if the coach said, get in there and hit him harder, I'd be like, okay, I will. And when this guy was going, this line here, that's a lazy line. You can do better. You need to approach it. And I remember going, instead of going, oh, wait a minute, that's my art. I remember going, yeah, all right, let me get home and get at that. I couldn't wait to get home and start revising.
Do a second draft.
Yeah.
So cool.
So now those are the two big signal moments. But then I stress again, I went back to nursing school. I went back to passing my boards, getting my nursing jobs. I did not go home and become a writer. I did start writing some pretty bad poetry. But when you asked up to this point, I've never met a writer, or at least someone who defines themselves as that. I met a few university professors who said they were poets, but I always said, no, you're a poet with dental insurance. There's difference and tenure. But anyway, I had not met anyone who wrote. And then one day I ran into the woman who used to be a librarian at our little high school. And I said, oh, what are you doing these days? She goes, well, I've been doing some freelance writing. I don't know what that is. I said, what is that? She goes, well, I wrote an article about the Red Cedar River, which was the river I grew up fishing and canoeing on. She said, I wrote an article about canoeing on the Red Cedar River, and I sold it to Wisconsin Trails magazine for $75. And I remember going, wait a minute, what? You can get paid for writing? Because the one other thing I hadn't mentioned is that I got, I was a solid B+, A- student in nursing school. But I just blew them out of the water with my papers and my essay questions. And matter of fact, they probably saved me. And so I just remember thinking, wait a minute, you can get paid to write? And so the next thing I did is I went to the library and I checked out a copy of the Writer's Market, which in those days was this gigantic physical book, mostly filled with how and where to send your writing. But there was a slim section in the front that basically was how to be a writer. And I'm sorry to say, I just read it and took it literally and started doing that. And here we are.
I don't know how many of those types of trade publications exist anymore. Yeah. Number one, whatever. They're on YouTube in some new format, I'm sure. But the idea This was not an MFA. This was
No.
not the Cornell writing program or whatever more prestigious thing that I can't name off the top of my head. Yeah. This was the like industry rag, how to access publisher's guide to like, please God, just do this, that nobody who says they want to be a writer will ever take the time to read. And you were like, well, this must be the gospel.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Self-addressed stamped envelopes, query letters. Yeah, it was all, I couldn't wait.
Format this like this.
It's that
I could get my $75 for talking about a river.
It's that combination of, naivete and stubbornness, right?
Yeah.
And you can get right into the whole imposter syndrome thing. I've had imposter syndrome a lot, but I've also reveled in it at times. It takes the pressure off sometimes. Things over time. I have an agent in New York who's terrific, and she hasn't made me rich, famous, or wealthy, but she has helped me have a wonderful life in writing. But every once in a while, I'll read, someone will get like their third positive review in the New York Times. And my book, I think I've gotten a mention in the New York Times once. And the guy called, it was for Population 485, and which is a book about going to my hometown and being a volunteer firefighter. And he said, oh, Perry wants to have it both ways. He wants us to think that he's just a regular guy, but then he wants us also to think that he's this literate author. And he called it sensitivo posturing. And I always wanted to meet that guy and go, you do understand that just the very use of the phrase sensitivo posturing is in and of itself sensitivo posturing. Sadly, we never had that opportunity. But every once in a while, I'll once a year, once every 2 years, I'll call my agent in New York. I'm like, how come, maybe if I could get a review here or a review there. And she would say, there's a thing called BookScan. And if you want to, I can tell you how many copies that book that got 3 reviews in the New York Times sold. And then we can look at your last book for HarperCollins and how many copies it sold. And maybe what you should do is just get back to work on the next one.
Maybe you should shut up.
All right, fair enough. Now, one thing it's really important to me to quick interject this, however. This can quickly sound like, and I've written at length about this also, especially in a book called Montaigne and Barn Boots. I did a chapter called Roughneck Intersectionality. This is not me being anti-academic. The world has suffered terribly from anti-intellectualism. Part of the difficulty, I always hate to use the word struggle because my struggle is not really a struggle, but I still live and serve on the fire department with the folks I grew up with. And we don't see the world the same way, to put it mildly, in many cases. And I do feel that anti-intellectualism has done a lot of damage. And I've written about the fact that I was raised to dismiss anything more complicated than a bag of feed. And that's not healthy. So all of this talk is not me being anti-academic. Some of my best mentors are the MFA. I have a buddy who got his MFA at the Iowa School, or that famous one. And I love his deep understanding and knowledge of literature and his ability to parse things and to break down metaphor. And so I learn from him all the time. But boy, more often than not, I'm just glad I am living a publish or perish life, but I'm doing it on my own terms.
What's the connection between the transition from nursing into starting to write?
That one's easy.
Yeah. And I specifically, you got to tell the story about that.
I hope I'm telling the right story. But
that's okay. I'm going to poke you towards one that
okay.
I'm delighted by, and I want to hear again live.
And I think I probably expressed it most carefully in an essay called Scarlet Ribbons, which is in my book Off Main Street. But the school of nursing that I attended, they taught us a holistic model of nursing. It was called the Loomis and Wood model. We hated it, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And the Loomis and Wood model was that holistically speaking, when you are in that exam room with a patient, of course you need to pay attention to the abdominal pain. But you need to also avoid tunnel vision. And you need to, when you talk to this person, connect with them. Pick up on any signs that there might be some other issue going on. Is there a socioeconomic issue going on? Is there an undetected symptom? What is their family structure? And you're just looking for all these other clues. And then from all of those different assessments, you then come to what we call the nursing assessment, and you come up with a care plan based on that. And so what I've always said is that nursing is about human assessment, and what is writing but human assessment. And so in both the sort of wifty-wafty sense and also on a very practical sense, my nurse's education has been essential in my becoming a writer. And in the wifty-wafty sense, it's that whole holistic assessment. It's that sitting down with someone and gathering this huge global disparate conglomeration of information, knowing I'm only going to take a few strands, but I want them all. And then on the very fundamental front, believe it or not, having listened to me just ramble and yammer here, I'm a very shy and introverted person. I would prefer never to leave this little room above my garage and just write all day. But I learned a long time ago I have to get out into public, A, to promote my work, and then B, in the years that I was very active as a freelancer, as a magazine freelancer, I'm cold calling and interviewing people and strangers all the time. And so I didn't like that, but I knew I had to do it. And so I always say the way I dealt with it was I just went back to my nurse's training, where I was taught how to go into a tiny room with a complete stranger and within the first 3 minutes ask them to take all their clothes off and describe their bowel habits. And if you can do that, surely you can interview Tim McGraw about his new album, right? So, yeah. So
You don't even have to ask him about his bowel movements.
And the other thing about nursing, and then also it really over the years has been reinforced. I think I got my first EMT license in 1988, and I'm still active as a first responder. Nursing, EMS, and fire, there's this constant presence of mortality. And I love that. Some people think it's dark, and every day I just know that, I may not finish this interview with you. I know because I've just seen people die 1,000 ways. And so rather than sitting down feeling dark about that, it gives me just enough vulnerability to treasure the moment, but it also gives me a hunger to just get after the next thing while I still have time.
Well, I certainly want you to make it through this interview. If you could do me that
Well,
solid. I know.
I don't know.
It's not promised. It's not promised.
You might get a bump in views.
Remember that time Mike Perry died on your podcast? That was fun.
I think it's because he never stopped to breathe between all the stories he was telling.
Okay, so leaving nursing into writing, because you're a crazy person. Nobody wants. Why would you leave?
Yeah, it was a big financial
good
hit.
job. Yeah, genius financial move right there. Tell me, I'm sure lots of people told you how smart this decision was that you were making.
Well, yeah, I took a transition job. So I was working as a nurse, and then I wanted to do some community theater because I mentioned I'm very shy, and I was thinking, you know what? I don't know what I want to do yet, but it might involve public speaking, and so I want to learn how to comport myself in public. And I'd done forensics in high school. That was invaluable. But then I wanted to do community theater because I thought, well, that's a good way to learn how to be up in front of people. And I couldn't do it as a nurse because they had to work split shifts. So you'd work night shifts. You couldn't get to rehearsals. So a physical therapy aide quit unexpectedly on our floor. And I said, well, I'm going to quit my nursing job and take the physical therapy aide because he works straight days. And they just said, you can't do that. It's over, like it was something like a 60% pay cut.
Yeah.
And I said, well, is there a rule somewhere? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, I just want to work days. And I got money saved. And I'm going to go to Europe next summer. So, and I want to do the plays. So I took that PT aide job and did theater. I did a couple of plays. And then I went and hitchhiked around Europe for a whole summer. And that was the summer of '89. And I would write every day. And I wrote and wrote and wrote. And I didn't really even know why. And then when I came back, the fall of 89 is when I thought, you know what, I'm going to give this writing thing a try. And I just assumed it'd be a matter of months before I was back nursing. And this is the other thing. It's a great little story about pluck and determination, but I had a nursing license in my back pocket. I say that I jumped out of the plane and started knitting my parachute on the way down. And it's true to an extent, but I also, a single guy, low overhead nursing degree. It wasn't like I was risking everything. But yeah, people just said, what are you doing? Well, then in the interim, I knew I couldn't make enough money writing out of the gate to even pay the rent. So I wanted a job that involved words, but also that I could put in my hours and then check out and then write for the rest of the day. What I didn't feel comfortable doing that with nursing because I was so new at nursing yet. And I felt I owed my patients a responsibility to be prepared when I showed up. And so if I left that day and I knew I had a patient with some procedure or some disorder that I didn't know enough about, I owed it to them to study that night and be ready to serve them. So I needed a job where I didn't have that responsibility. So I answered a newspaper ad. It was a company looking for proofreaders. And it turns out they were a company that put on seminars for attorneys. And they were required education, continuing ed seminars that they had to take. So they really didn't have to do stellar product. They just had to make it count. And they would send out all these brochures. This was pre-internet. And so my job was just to make sure there were no mistakes on the brochures. And so I show up for the interview. They put you in a room and they give you a proofreading test. I'd never proofread anything in my life. I didn't know the symbols or anything like that. But I just said, look, I'll just show you where I think the mistakes are. Also, I can't diagram a sentence. I write by ear. I don't know the rules of language. If I'm coming up on a who-whom situation, I'll take 3 left turns just to get out of it, right? So I'm writing by ear. So I take this proofreading test. I hand it into them. Then I go in for the interview and they say, no one has ever scored this high on the proofreading test. And I said, I don't know, I'm just winging it. Then they interview me and they asked me a lot of questions, but this is a job. You're proofreading brochures for $6.25 an hour. So it's not like it's going to be really intense, but you can just tell they're perplexed. And so then I do the interview. I don't remember much about what we covered, but they said, well, we'll let you know. Well, then I get a call for a second interview.
Oh, God.
For
$6.25 an hour.
For $6.25 an hour. I go in for the second interview. This interview, they've brought in the vice president of the company. And so they interview me a little more. And then finally, she just kind of pulls up to the table and goes, look, I got to cut to the chase. She said, none of this makes any sense. We know what you were making as an RN at the hospital across town. Why are you taking this job? And I explained what I already explained to you. I will do a good job, but I want to be able to shut it off at 4:30 and work, on my writing till midnight and come in and work for you the next day. And then at one point she said, well, where do you see your future at this company? And I said, I thought I had one of those split second debates with myself. And then I just said, well, I'm going to go with this. So I just said, well, I'll tell you what, I know that what I'm supposed to say is, I'll work hard, and then hopefully within, 3 to 5 years, I'll be in middle management. And then maybe at some point there's a chance to advance even higher. But I said, but honestly, here's the deal. Every day that you see me come through that front door, I'm going to be here at least 2 more weeks, because that's how much notice I'll give you. And the room just kind of went silent. And I went home, and later they called and said, yeah, come on in. So I wound up working there and for, I don't know, I think maybe 1.5 years, 2 years, just enough until I got to where I was doing enough writing. And a local guy started an ad agency, and I used to write ad copy for him. And I just had just enough. But man, there were a lot of years where my income, if I get my Social Security statement, a lot of those years were 4 figures.
All right. I'm fast forwarding a little bit in the interest
of better.
I can ask you a million questions about this forever. But I needed that because there was a bunch of questions about growing up that I was fuzzy on how this stuff came together.
Yeah.
Up to this point, and that was what I did want you to tell, was the story of saying, if you see me, you at least have 2 weeks. Because I think that's one of my favorite lines of research from these. The becoming then an actual writer. And so I think I'm asking you in present day, Mike Perry, looking back and just thinking of, I say this respectfully, like you're not Stephen King. You just told the New York Times story.
Yeah.
You're being a writer without being You're not a household name in most households,
No.
but you're very, very meaningful in a bunch of little pockets of communities between the novels, the Montaigne and Barn Boots book, which is phenomenal. You have all these corners and all these ways that you're pressing out, but you're just like, you're trying to fill a little bit of space. That's not the normal approach we hear when we talk to people about, oh, they're an author. What is this space that you're occupying, and how do you make sense of it?
Well, the main way that I make sense of the big picture is that I do a lot of stuff. I do one-man shows in theaters. I do corporate speaking gigs. I'm not the like face microphone, go win guy. I just tell funny stories and that relate in some way to the group that hires me. But I do the one-man shows in theaters that are straight humor. I have a band. We do shows in small theaters. I do voiceover work. I write scripts. But mostly I write essays and books. And the one thing that I never lose sight of is that whatever I'm doing, whether it's a voiceover project, whether it's a speaking gig, none of it happens if I don't sit down alone and write. And so I'm very comfortable with the idea that I am a writer. That's what I do. I'm less comfortable with the idea of calling myself a writer because where I come from, it just... I think in the Montaigne book... Yes, in the Montaigne book, I think the quote I had was, where I come from, if you can't stack it or stack with it, it don't count. And a stack of books don't count. And that's okay. These are my people. I'm very comfortable with them, and I can give and take with the best of them. So I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that's how it is. But yeah, at the end of the day, I just know that none of it happens if I don't sit down and write. So was that the question? Or, how do I think of myself? Or...
Yeah, well, it's how do you contextualize this? Because it also means part of it's very project-based. Part of it's, at face value, someone might mistake what you're doing as transactional. You go out, you do a show with the band, you get paid, and then that's it. But there's still a scale or a thing that you're building, and I feel like it's an experiential thing in the connection with the communities of people you're doing it for.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll speak to, and a quick glance at the state of the world will tell you that I have failed, is, and it's come up again and again in this conversation, my heart breaks at the disconnect between certain groups of people. And in the Montaigne book, I write about taking my daughters to the Shakespeare Festival one night, and then 2 days later we went to the Demolition Derby at Augusta Bean and Bacon Days. And both experiences were transcendent and wonderful. And yet so few people did I recognize at both events. And so if you read pretty much everything I've ever written, it is that attempt to sort of say, hey, you can go to the modern dance recital and the softball tournament in the same day. I've done it. It's great. And by the way, it's not about me saying you should be like me because I'm omnivorous and I'm amazing. No, all it does is it just opens you up for more opportunities for joy, rich experience. And, and I'm also get that whole business of, well, I just don't get it. Well, I don't get most of what I see. I talk about, I didn't get it that maybe I should answer a letter from Cornell University. But what I have learned over time is that if I do go to the modern dance recital at the Joyce Theater in Chelsea, yeah, I maybe do stick out a little bit in the wrong way, but I don't care. It was amazing. It was beautiful. It was lovely. And then I'm back. I just wrote this big, long essay about pitching shows in L.A. and coming back here and baling straw with my dad. And I try to get at a lot of this stuff. But, one of the things I mentioned in that piece is I said I'm going to L.A. and I had some meetings in New York recently. And my rough, tumble, concealed carry, overly tattooed Ford Raptor, jacked up pickup truck buddies are like, oh, be careful. Don't go out there. So I'm like, dude, I thought you were the badasses, right? I'm the soft-handed writer, dude, okay? So am I going to ride the subway in New York? Yes, at every opportunity. Am I going to stare at my phone and not pay attention to my surroundings? No. Are there places in L.A. where I hope that my Waymo doesn't stall out? Yes. But am I going to deprive myself of that experience? But then on the flip side, am I going to deprive myself of the experience of hanging out in my brother's shop, cutting up deer with a bunch of Amish yahoos, and the stories that flow and the red meat ground level joy of that experience? And so ultimately, again, I can't really remember what you asked me, but I think I'm trying to parse all of this stuff for myself and hoping that someone else will relate. And maybe I do have very granular examples of people saying that, I have a story that I've never written about it, but I had a really rough dude come up to me at a very small town library reading and say that the thing I wrote about my gay dancer friend changed the way that he treated, because he used to abuse that guy. And he said, I quit. And so I can't fix the world. But I hope that some folks can relate and this also leads me into, I get taken to tasks by certain groups sometimes, more regionally, because I won't speak out in the standard binary terms on the issue of the day. And I'm willing to be called a coward if that makes you feel better. But the point is, I'm doing book readings in a gymnasium in Luck, Wisconsin, and that crowd is not of one mind, except that they're all laughing at the same funny story, except that they're all sitting there quietly listening to a very carefully, I hope poetically phrased passage from a personal memoir. It's just that I know better than to tell them I'm going to read to them from a memoir, right?
You got to trick them a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm nervous right now because I hear the timbre, which is, I had to learn how to pronounce that, of my voice has gone up, which is always a sign to me that I'm getting a little too much on my high horse. So
Bring it back to timber.
It's more out of a desire. When I think way back early in this conversation, we talked about gathering together to see a musical performance in a small venue or even a comedy performance. And it's that what we deprive ourselves of when, I think in Montaigne, I wrote about, we'd rather listen to the man yelling in the distance than the person in the boat beside us. It's like, out of words.
I wanted to, and I'm going to ask you, I made a couple of notes, but I think I want to start with this part.
Let her rip.
Is we don't have a lot of examples that we point at as professionals, as business people, as whatever else, where we point at people and say, like, you're an example of a business that much like a wonderful local restaurant, you're not going to be McDonald's.
Right.
And it's back to that ceiling thing again, where it's like, no, I don't have to be. In fact, I don't want to call it a virtue, but it's kind of a virtue.
Well, and if it's not a virtue, it's actually an advantage in the current market. I mean,
1,000% is an advantage.
I have survived because of what the corporate folks refer to as multiple revenue streams. And
yeah, we can call them the fancy names, or we can just acknowledge what it is and what it's doing.
Yeah. I don't remember if I told this. I think I'd maybe told this story already to you. And if I did, you can just edit it out. But did I talk about the project where they were saying, does this project feel too middle of the road, too hokey for you? And I said, literally an hour ago, I was making a TikTok trying to sell a T-shirt. So no, it doesn't sound too hokey. I have principles. I have turned things down. I turned Oprah down once. But speaking of keeping yourself irrelevant, but yeah, the diversity of opportunity, and you know what? To tie it back to financials, it's what that guy taught me about mutual funds long before I had money to put in mutual funds. It's like, don't buy one stock, buy a basket of stocks. And so I also tie it back to my father and those old farmers. And I wrote this book called Improbable Mentors. And in there, I said those old farmers back in the day, rather than just be monoculture, they had dairy cows for the milk check. They had logging in the winter because everything was froze up anyway and you could skid the logs. And then they had a flock of sheep that on a good year, the lambs and the wool would cover the taxes. And that was a lesson that, again, I didn't take overtly, but implicitly. Yeah, I think that the other thing is you can pay attention to your audience. I mean, I've had opportunity to peek behind the scenes of some truly hugely successful people. And what it takes to, in the entertainment world, and what it takes to feed that machine once you've established it there are some people who've handled it very, very well. And I've always said, I'm prepared to prove that I can handle ridiculous financial success. But in the meantime, the bills are paid. I sleep well at night. I was just talking with another friend of mine who writes for Marvel Comics and is a novelist, and he lives in rural Minnesota. And we both have wives who aren't that interested in what we do. And I mean that in the best way. They're proud of us, but they're not our fans. And we both have children who have given us both joys and challenges. And we were talking about, he's a little younger than me, but we're at that age too, where I just go, there are days, and I'm not talking out of school, my wife and I talk about this, where I want to be that wild and crazy free artist. And I want to be why wasn't I the guy who partied into the night and wrote this amazing thing? But instead, at 9 o'clock, said, I'm going to head home, put the kids to bed, and start over tomorrow. And what I've found is that very limitation has kept me healthier, has kept me attuned to the things that really matter in the long term. It doesn't mean that I don't still appreciate a train wreck of an artist, because I wrote about that recently too, about, I like that they go out and keep a record of these things. I always says that they take the dents in rehab so that I don't have to. But even being, if I may, tethered to family is a positive. It's a form of diversity of experience. I can't just go be a peer artist because the kid is sick. And that's more important right now.
I'm sending people, if they want the Oprah story, because also prior guest of this series, Jim O'Shaughnessy, you guys had a great riff together in your podcast on your mutual Oprah stories. So if you've got to this point, you want to hear the Oprah story, too bad. Go find it on Jim on Infinite Loops. They went there. I'm jumping right next to, I'm curious how you think about it. And it came up a couple of times, I think. Charity and humility today. What does charity and humility mean for you today at this stage of your life?
Charity and humility for me will always be defined by my parents and watching how they lived their life. My mom has now completed her tour on this world, in this world. My dad is still with us. To me, charity, it's not about putting $1 in the can. It's about how you treat your fellow human being. And I'll never live up to them. And I think I've tried to cover for it by volunteering on the fire department. I'm not a good joiner. I've never have been. So that's been my volunteer pursuit of choice. And charity and goodness knows we all need it. We just need people to give us some slack. And we as a society have gotten out of the habit of giving each other slack. So that's my definition of charity. Of course, if you have the financial means, do so, but also just in your spirit and in your interactions with people. And then the humility thing is interesting because I do believe in humility. I do want to travel close to the ground, and not because I'm such a wise person, but because we're all bound to fall, and I just want to be close to the ground when it happens. And so I mean it in that sense, but I have a late dear friend, Billy, a musician, and I mentioned him in the Improbable Mentors book for different reasons, which you can read about. But in the Montaigne book, I write about Billy taking me to task about, I'm very self-deprecating, partly because I'm from the Midwest, partly because I have plenty of reason to be self-deprecating. But one time I was on stage with the band, and when I play with the band, I write all the songs and I sing them. So I'll accept singer-songwriter, but I'm not a musician. I'm a guy who learned 4 chords and 2 rhythms. And the people around me, they support me. When I get lost, they take care of business because they are musicians. And so I always acknowledge that, and I thank them, and I say, I'm really not a musician. And one time we did a show, and at intermission, Billy quietly just said, you got to be careful with that self-deprecating stuff. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're just out there saying, you're not a musician. And I said, well, I'm trying to acknowledge you guys. And he said, no, and we appreciate that. But he said, but if you take self-deprecation, a form of humility, too far, then you're basically telling your audience, you people are idiots for having paid $25 to listen to this. And he goes, and that's not true. So I would say that my definition of humility, once again, begins with my parents and their true humility. but it has been seasoned and calibrated by my dear late friend Billy.
So basically, they're paying $24 to see the band, $1 to see you.
That's right.
That's right.
Pretty much.
Okay. Important book recommendation time. Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey books. What are like the tops?
Well, I love Zane Grey. I believe it was his book. I hope it wasn't Max Brand, but I think it was Zane Grey who wrote To the Far Blue Mountains or The Far Blue Mountains. And I wrote a novella called 40 Acres Deep, which is really dark. It's short. It's about a farmer and winter and existentialism. But in there, I talk about, through his eyes, an experience I had, which was a Wisconsin kid growing up in the white pines and swamps and flatlands of my part of Wisconsin, and reading those books about the far blue mountains, and then going to Wyoming and seeing, oh, they really do look blue when they're far away. But you can't name a favorite Louis L'Amour book. I got to say, even as a fan, there was a certain similarity and plot, even after book 100. Yeah. But one of my favorites happens to be right here, which is The Quick and the Dead. And, of course, you've got your lonesome, stoic gunslinger standing there in the snow. And he's probably in love with some woman. He hasn't told her yet. And she's a woman of some rectitude, but in some danger. And he would never, ever do anything untoward in her presence. He may possibly, on the very last page, give her a little kiss, but nothing more than that. Meanwhile, he has no hesitation about pumping people full of hot lead.
But truly life lessons for the young mind.
Actually, you're probably trying to wrap this up, but very quickly I'm reminded, here's the thing. You asked about becoming a writer, and I said writers to me they were people who were distant and mysterious, and so I could never be one. But at the end of every Louis L'Amour book, there was just this bio. And it's the same bio in everyone. And I read it, every time I would finish it, I would read it. But it took me until way into my adulthood to realize the message, which was Louis L'Amour was from North Dakota. He worked as a mule skinner. He worked on freighters. And I remember going, well, wait a minute, if Louis L'Amour then can become a writer. And at that time, the other two big influences were Waylon Jennings and Steve Earle. And they were two artists who taught me you can care about beauty and music and poetry and words and rhythm and still be a good old boy. You know, you don't have to just... I have a dear friend who's become a very successful indie artist, and I love to tease him. I go, I love you guys' music, but so much scarves and crying.
I don't see Steve Earle in a lot of scarves.
Some of us just want to be Waylon.
Some of us just want to be Waylon.
Yeah.
I have another question for you before I wrap this up with you. Getting stubborn about it as a strategy.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what you want me to say, but I will say I guess it's maybe Midwestern. It's also class. It's also farmers and loggers. It's also growing up in the cold. We got that. You know, we talked in this interview about realizing your ceiling and going, hey, I'm never going to be the flashiest guy. I'm never going to be the fastest guy. I'm never going to be the guy who has a million seller. But I am going to be the guy where 10 years go by and one day you look down and go, wait a minute, you're still here?
You wrote another one.
And yeah, that's kind of been it. I joke about it too. Sometimes I just say my secret to success, I'm too dumb to know when to quit. But truly it just is what's next. I was talking to my daughter about this. She said, do you ever wish you had become more famous, Dad? She's gotten old enough to sort of see what I've done and understand it in the context. And she said, do you ever wish you'd been more famous or more successful? And I said, well, sure, financially things could have been easier. But I said, at the age I'm at now, I said, I get to do all these different things, and yet they all come back to writing. Life has been rich and full. It continues to be full. And when I get up in the morning, and it happened this morning, the first thing I want to do is get to the keyboard. I want to write. And so that's kind of the bottom line, and being excited about the next thing and just being able to slog. Man, I'm built like a mule.
to the slog, to the absolute lack of sensitivo posturing. Just let the
That's
record
right.
show the absolute lack of sensitivo posturing here. A little bit of imposter syndrome along the way, as there need. My defense on imposter syndrome that I try to tell myself is I'm the poster boy syndrome is the worst thing. And I can handle imposter so long as I never think I'm the poster boy for some ridiculousness.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing I've learned over life is that 90% of the room has it.
Exactly.
And the ones that don't are the ones you're talking about.
That's you just don't want to be in that camp because Mike, this has been an absolute ball. Your bailing piece that you did for Panoptica, which you referenced there, is absolutely beautiful. That was part of my excitement to get you on this show too. I'm going to loop you into a bunch of crap, so sorry in advance for me continuing to bug you. People want to read some of the books. They want to bug you on the internet. Where should we send them?
Just go to sneezingcow.com. And the reason it's not michaelperry.com is because there's another guy that has that URL, and he doesn't even spell his name the same as me, but he was smart enough to grab it.
To grab all the things.
Sneezingcow.com, and that's from a humor album I did 1,000,000 years ago. Speaking of stubborn, I just rented a church and told a bunch of stories out loud and recorded them in front of an audience, and sold cassettes in gas stations for years. And that at this point, that silly bunch of stories has paid for one of my houses. And those stories contain a whole riff on the idea that, and if you were raised on a farm, I don't need to explain to you, but you should never stand behind a sneezing cow. And I'm not going to explain it today, but if you grew up on basically it involves
worked on a farm. Yeah.
Yeah, you understand. If a cow sneezes, something shoots out the rear end, and it's not milk.
That's where chocolate milk comes from?
So
Mike
sneezingcow.com,
Perry.
and if you go to the little store section there, it's got all the things that I've written and published, and also links to, we're on social media, and my daughter just got me on TikTok.
Well, if you haven't gotten a million or a billion followers at something yet, there's always the next social media for you.
I believe we just roared past 30 on TikTok, so
watch out now. I can't wait to do the Mike Perry dance or whatever happens on TikTok in the next.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, sneezingcow.com. Man, this was a blast. Thank you for just letting me ramble.
Hey, you are truly an intentional investor, even if investor means, I think, a lot more than we like to give it credit for. This was a ball. I love this story. Everybody, check us out. You are watching The Intentional Investor on Epsilon Theory YouTube, and we are out.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you're watching The Intentional Investor so more people can find our show. You can follow Matt directly at cultishcreative.com or at cultishcreative on Twitter. For more great content at the intersection of investing and life, check out epsilontheory.com or at Epsilon Theory on Twitter.